My name is Paul Vixie. I'm from Farsight Security. I used to be with ISC, so if you've ever had to stay up late on a Friday night patching bind, it was probably one of my bugs. Here to talk about passive DNS challenges today. Passive DNS was invented about almost a decade ago in Germany by Florian Weimar, and it's become common enough to use passive DNS for security purposes that the bad guys are starting to figure out how to evade this tool. And we knew this was coming. There's no such thing as a silver bullet. So we've been thinking for years now sort of what we would do next once they adapted to what we were doing now. And I have some ideas to share with you on that topic. We're going to give you some examples. These will be largely U.S.-centric examples because that's where the people who write these slides live, but I think you'll find that they are portable to any region. And we have some interesting ways to combine results in a way that sort of restores the capability of passive DNS as a security technique. I guess the first thing to say there is, although my company is in the passive DNS business, we are not the only ones, and this is not a product pitch. I'll be using our product for demo because that's what I have access to. But there are other passive DNS providers, and these techniques will work just as well no matter where you're getting your passive service. Maybe an IP address, something. And that becomes our starting point. That's the one thing we know about the attacker is sort of how they reached us. They reached us from, maybe what domain name they tried to get us to reach them on. And take that and then sort of do the normal guilt by association techniques. In other words, what other domain names point at that IP address or nearby IP addresses or IP addresses in the same autonomous system? There's a lot of different ways to find associated resources, and then you look for patterns among those associations. And you might be able to, in some cases, you'll find, the bad guys hid who is on all of these, but not on all of those. And so you might even find some meat space recourse from passive DNS. But this is becoming less usable because the bad guys are watching what we do and adapting to it like they always do. And one of the problems with this is that they know we're going to start with the most unique search that we can. In other words, if they come at us with an IP address, we're going to look at other things that have used that IP address. Or if we check to see what name servers were responsible for the domains they used in an attack, then they're potentially all they have to do is use those name servers only once, and then they're free and clear. Now, the idea of using the same domain name over and over again is almost unheard of because domain names are now too cheap to meter. It's possible for bad guys to get a pretty much inexhaustible supply of domain names for criminal purposes, but they still do go back to the same watering hole from time to time. But either way, if they know you're going to do that, they will just say, I'm not going to do what you think I'm going to do. So they might hide their domain name inside of a large provider where it's not just their IP, it's a whole bunch of different domain names all using the same IP and not belonging to the same person, right? This would be an IP hosting farm. So we can hope that they will be stubbornly fond of a particular domain name, and you can hope that they will run their own name servers and that they won't be using shared infrastructure, but that's not what happens. So I've seen plenty of attacks. This is largely spam and phishing attacks, but I've seen plenty of attacks that use a domain name one time and throw it away, and so it doesn't associate with anything else. It never pointed at a different IP address. You can't tell what carrier, what ISP or hosting provider they may have been kicked off before, because the domain name didn't exist until this attack. Or, as I said, they might hide inside of some CDN where there will be millions of domain names pointing at a single set of IP addresses for that are actually a very high-performance load balancer. So knowing that there are 10 million other domains pointing at that IP does not help us in our investigations at all. And you can also commingle at the name server level. For example, if you're using GoDaddy or Network Solutions, who are not criminals, but they can't tell the difference among their customers about who the criminals are, and so you might be using a name server that is also supporting tens of millions of other name servers. And that's kind of hiding in plain sight, shouting insults from a crowd, as it were. Now, what you'll have to do as a bad guy to pull that lone wolf scenario off is to truly not reuse anything. So you can't use the same registrar for consecutive attacks. You can't use the same name servers. You cannot use anything that is valid in the whois, no matter what. But in this case, it turns out bad guys will often use the same whois data over and over again. That's a signature that some of the passive whois providers are using to do the guilt by association, is they'll use the same random string or the same fake address on some non-existent street that corresponds to the parking lot of a hospital somewhere. They can't do that. They must be completely unique. The payment is another place where if they're using stolen credit cards, they need to use it once and throw it away rather than using the same stolen credit card for, some collection of different domain names that they're buying. You need different images on the website, because if you are, let's say it's a phishing attack and you're trying to get somebody to click on a website that you're trying to convince them corresponds to their bank, unless it's a very well-targeted attack, they're guessing which bank is yours. But just the same, they need to construct a fake website into which you can type your credentials. Not you, but the victim types the credentials. And that website ends up having to include a lot of image resources. And, we have actually seen bad guys take a PNG file and sort of resize it in some way that it will have a different hash than the real image. I've even seen, hand-edited versions of like the American Express logo, and that's simply to avoid looking like the American Express website to a web crawler. And if you put all this energy in, then you can, at the moment, hide from a lot of people, a lot of investigators that are using Passive DNS, or for that matter, Passive Whois. Of course, whois is almost always junk, and providers who rent or lease or whatever they make their sub-blocks of their IP address space available to customers are supposed to, by rule, put in an rwhois assignment so that the actual user of a block of IP address spaces has real contact information. However, that rwhois rule is not widely followed. I can remember during my years on the ARIN Board of Trustees, ARIN is like APNIC, but for the United States. I remember when we started having trouble keeping the whois records for our own, not customers, but registrants, the people that ARIN was handing IP address space to, because we were out of IPv4, and the only time we really had any leverage was when they came back for more space. It used to be that if they were coming back for more IPv4 space every year or two, then you could talk to them at that time and say, gee, your whois information is not nearly as clean as we'd like it to be. You can't do that with v6. Most people come to somebody like ARIN or APNIC exactly one time, get a lifetime supply of IPv6 address space, and they will never be back. So you never have an opportunity as an address registry to say that you'd like them to clean up their whois information. There's nothing, they don't need anything else from you, so there's nothing you can withhold from them until they clean it up. So we're seeing that Whois, while it was always bad, is now degrading further. And of course, there's Whois privacy. There are lawyers all over the world now who have opened side businesses just to represent people in Whois. So it's a nuisance level fee, it's a tiny amount of money, and it just means that the Whois information for a given domain name or IP address block, or even an ASN in some cases, is your lawyer's address, and that's not illegal. And ICANN cannot regulate at that level. So I think we're going to see Whois privacy here to stay. But in any case, if you want to keep people from finding you, if you're a criminal attacker, you have plenty of ways to make sure Whois doesn't help them. Now, if you let's imagine that you've got this problem where they're using a name server that's also serving a lot of other domains. You probably can't then look at the name server and say, oh, there's 10 million domains, those probably belong to the same person, because it's pretty rare that 10 million domains are going to belong to the same person. So you're not going to be, you'll get no help from that. But what you can do is look for the subset of those domains that have also shown up, maybe in the Spam House black hole list, or in other reputation systems, and look at the history of other assets. And 10 million is a lot for you and I, but luckily computers are fast, and you can often come up with a subset of those, which if you drill down into the subset, instead of 10 million, you've got maybe 10,000. Then you'll find some kind of similarity in the way that the Whois data has been randomized. So this is weak. This is where we're left if we don't get smarter, and we don't want to be here. Reverse proxies are often used by criminals. That doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that they can be used for both good or evil. So I would say that Akamai and a number of the DDoS protection services and Cloudflare and so forth are all in this business. And what you'll see there is, all right, so www dot, something that sounds like my bank's name, dot some TLD, is going through Akamai or Cloudflare or something like that, and I can't get necessarily Akamai or Cloudflare to tell me who the real customer is, who they're selling services to. Maybe you don't have lawyers in their country, or maybe you don't want the subpoena process, or there's a number of reasons why a reverse proxy is kind of a blank wall when you're tracking bad guys. So what you can do there that's interesting is look at the records that do not correspond to web service. Right, the quad A record is used to hold an IPv6 address. The A record is the older style that holds an IPv4 address, and those are going to point at a proxy provider. But the other records tend not to. So, for example, their MX, which specifies their mail server, might actually point at a real mail server that only serves them, or maybe only serves a few hundred people rather than a few tens of millions of people. As I'll demonstrate further on in this talk, we've also found that the text record often has an SPF, which is a sender policy framework record, to indicate where their email is supposed to come from for this domain. And that, again, can end up uniquely identifying them because they're not putting their mail through the same proxy provider that they're putting their web service through. Now, in spite of the fact that it can be hard to get a subpoena in a country that you don't have offices or you don't have lawyers or whatever, you will often find that these reverse proxy operators are quite ready to cooperate. They might not tell you anything, but they will take your complaint and add that to the pile of complaints that they're already working with their local law enforcement on a similar case. So it's always worth reaching out to them, even if they're not going to cooperate directly and explicitly. So one important technique that we all need to take away from this is that bad guys are watching not just what the security industry does, but what the advertising industry does. So in the ad industry, the thing they most care about is the number of impressions. They want to know how many eyeballs saw a given ad, and ideally they would like them to be unique. They would like to know that the person who saw this ad also saw that one. And maybe that doesn't help them identify you in meat space, but it'll help them show you a better ad or a more targeted ad when you go somewhere else. And that's what cookies are all about. It's a lot of controversy about this type of tracking, but bad guys do the same thing. And what that means is that if you start following URLs that are found in the body of email or found on various websites, it may be that they are a single-use URL, and they're going to work exactly one time, and subsequent attempts will get different content. And that helps them to first find out if there is some kind of security event following. In other words, is somebody investigating me because only the victim should have looked this up, but look, 3 days later I got more hits on the same web page. But it also lets them track their victims, and it allows them to obfuscate their text. It may be that you went to the same website the victim went to, but you got a totally different result. It wasn't the phishing website anymore by the time you got to it. So to the extent that it's possible, we should not be automatically following the URLs when we are tracking this stuff. And I'm betting that most of you already knew this, but I'm going to tell you that there are some security researchers that are tracking using tools that are the same tools they use for their own enterprise web or mail services, and they do automatically prefetch stuff. So you should make sure you don't do that. I have found in general that if you're using the shell, you're only getting what you expect, but if you're using a graphical tool, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. Right. Last but not least, if you start doing non-passive, actually intrusive lookups on assets that the bad guy exposed in spam in particular, they will be able to tell from the URL that you used, because it was a single-use URL, they'll be able to tell exactly which email they sent that caused you to be able to do that research. In other words, they can find your spam trap just by looking at the URLs that came in, just by looking at the weblog, essentially, from their HTTP server. Okay, I'm going to get into a couple of examples. I'm going to start with pills. Pills with a Z is the name that we give in the local sort of U.S. community to fake pharma, fake drugs. And they aren't always fake drugs, but my own belief is that if you're buying drugs that are not licensed in some way by your local government, then you're taking maybe a slightly bigger chance that it isn't really the drug that you paid for. So I myself don't use them. That doesn't mean that it's evil, but it is dangerous, and people have been hurt by it. So taking no moral position, I just want to say this is how you stop it if you don't like it. So this is a real ad that we got. In the U.S., most of our pills spam is about Canadian pharmacies, because in Canada they sell the exact same drug from the exact same producer for about half the price, just having to do with national health laws and so forth. So a lot of the Canadian pills that we are offered are actually the good stuff, but there are some bad ones in there. But anyway, this is a real site. This was actually found, and pillstoronto.net was the domain name. So we took a look at Passive DNS, and we said, all right, so we see Cloudflare, and we see that it's been on Cloudflare since June 7th of last year. But what else do we know? Well, it turns out that before they went to Cloudflare, they were elsewhere. And because Passive DNS keeps a history, our particular history goes back to 2010, but any kind of history will help you, because if they didn't know this was happening, they will end up using a non-obfuscated IP address that isn't part of a proxy provider, and it uniquely identifies them for a year or two while they're testing and while they're screwing around. And then when they decide to go active and start using the asset in attacks, then they will make this change. So this is actually a good demonstration of why passive DNS is helpful, because we not only saw the history, we saw the history without sending any queries into the network. And once again, I want to say this is our particular system, but there are a half dozen companies that offer passive DNS. So whichever one you're using will have this feature. So in this case, we looked at the other domain names that pointed at the other IP addresses, and found a whole collection of different different bad guys and different fake pharmacies, and went through some. There are plenty of pills forums, and you can go through there and find out sort of what somebody's online handle was and what they've said about their operations. And anyway, this was a trivial example, but it just showed that history, you got to have history, and this is part of what they have to evade. This is why they now use a domain name exactly once and then throw it away, as they don't want to leave a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to their house. So here's an example. In America, they have something they call football that is not what the rest of the world calls football. It's an odd-shaped ball and so forth. But anyway, there's a lot of money being made in merchandise by not just American football, but real football around the world. The ticket sales is a small part of how that sports commercial industry makes money. And so there's a great deal of money to be made selling fake merchandise that has some team's logo, and people will buy it. And in fact, a lot of times people will buy the counterfeit goods without even caring if it's licensed, because all they care about is that it has their favorite team's logo on it. So it's no concern to them if their team didn't make money from that purchase. So here is jet lag. This is a news story about how the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Group inside the U.S. government found 5,000 related websites. And we looked at one of those. And San Francisco 49ers is my home team. I was born in San Francisco. I live just south of there now. And so if I were looking for a jersey, I'm not really a football fan, but if I were looking for a jersey, this is the kind of thing I might have found. And this is a pretty good imitation. It's a little bit older. It's a picture of how the website used to look. It tends to be a year or two out of date. But a lot of the style elements were copied from the original website. In other words, they mirrored the whole thing, and then they modified the parts they cared about to make it point at their servers instead of the real servers for any e-commerce that might result. I want to say that even though you can often buy a counterfeit jersey, in this case a shirt or a hat, that has the right logo on it, it happens just as often that you put your money in and nothing comes out. So this is not just a way to sell fake goods. This is often a way to simply defraud someone on a credit card transaction. So anyway, we looked up the domain name. On the left, you have official49ersjersey.com, and on the right, you have nflshop.com. And, just looking at the Whois data, you can kind of tell that there's something wrong with the one on the left. And I'm not saying that there aren't plenty of legitimate companies in China that are selling these goods. This tends to get outsourced all the time. But this was a little bit much. Postal code of 123,123 is a clue. That pattern also shows up in the registrant phone. And if you know anything about the NFL as a business, then you would know more than what's obvious here, and you would be able to say, they haven't outsourced that. NFL Shop is what they use for all of their football apparel. And you can see the registrar is Mark Monitor. That's a pretty high-end registrar. They charge a lot of money per year because they're not just doing registrar services for you, they're also doing brand protection. And you can also see the creation date was 1999, which is roughly speaking when the NFL decided to get onto the internet. Whereas on the left we see a creation date of September of 2015, and we know that the 49ers have been online longer than that. So if this really were a 49ers website, it would have an earlier creation date. So anyway, this was a pretty easy one to find. Nevertheless, there are some other examples to be drawn from it. So we looked at the address records, and sure enough, they were behind a proxy provider, Cloudflare in this case. I'm not picking on Cloudflare, by the way. I'm using them in the examples because they are very successful, so they show up everywhere, but they're no better or worse than Akamai and all the other CDNs and proxy providers. So anyway, there was a proxy provider, but the MX record, not so. That MX record pointed at DC-96, whatever, a hexadecimal gibberish, not the same domain name. And the address record associated with that MX record, in other words, the place you would open an SMTP session to if you were a victim of spam and you were trying to, send mail saying that you wanted to buy something, would go to this IP address that, again, is not hidden behind Cloudflare. Proxy providers don't do email front-ending because that isn't where the performance problem is. There's no market for legitimate services that hide inbound mail services. So then we did the normal, regular passive DNS dance and asked the question, so what else uses this domain name? Here we used a tool whose output is in JSON format so that we could pipe it through JQ, which is a command line JSON utility. And there's a script on the next slide, is a short Perl script that we wrote called second level domain. That just finds the effective TLD. I'll explain that in a moment. And finally, just sort it for uniqueness. And then we found, oh, good, there's a whole bunch of other domain names that had the same IP. And all those other domain names look just about as spammy and as fishy as the one we started from. I want to say the passive DNS system that we developed has become a bit of a template. So our API is now documented in an IETF RFC, and the tools that I'm using here will probably work on our competitors' passive DNS systems as well. And they're all open source. This one that I demonstrated here is the C version that I wrote. So even though I wrote it, it's pretty safe. So this is second level DOM. The public suffix list is an extremely useful tool because what you really want to know when you're looking at a domain name is not so much what does who is say or who are the name servers or the rest of that. You want to know what is the delegation point. So if you're looking at a fully qualified domain name, www.foo.bar. whatever it is, what you're looking for is what part of this was bought from a registry. In other words, actually bought from a registrar and then allocated by a registry. So for .com, it's easy. It's whatever is under .com. So example.com, vix.com, blackhat.com, those were all delegation points. And in other parts of the world, it is not as easy to figure out where the purchase occurred. For example, in the United Kingdom, they put all of that stuff under co.uk. There are plenty of free DNS providers that will put something at a third or fourth level. So discovering exactly what is the handoff point between some domain provider and some domain consumer is something originally had to be done for web purposes. In other words, the web browsers of the world have to figure out what should be the domain of a cookie. If you come up with a cookie that says, I should be sent to any .com site, then you need to throw that cookie away because that would leak a lot of information. So you need to know, as a web browser creator, where to stop people's cookies from traveling. And that same mechanism is very useful for security because what we cared about, let me go back up here, page up, was not, I want to see that hexadecimal gibberish on every one of these domain names. I want to see the delegation point on all of those, and that's what this second level DOM script does. So these slides will be made available. The publicsuffix.org site has other tools. This is obviously just a short cheesebag Perl script. This is something I recommend everybody use in their automation so that you can throw away the deeper part of domain names that are not really helpful at all in your investigations. Okay, good, we got plenty of time. So we took those domain names and did whois lookup, I think. I'm not showing the whois lookup. But we looked at the domain name, the email address. So it's cj2015tit@126.com. And we went to this really useful online website called Domain Big Data that told us all of the domain names that had that in their whois contact. And that gave us an even longer list of domain names that were pretty much, we think, owned by the same criminal, even though they hadn't shown up in our passive DNS search. And that actually is the beginning of what I mean by multivariate evaluation, because you're looking at two different data sources and then looking for the intersection between two sets of results in order to filter out the noise. It's something that I'm sure the machine learning people do all the time, but this is not machine learning. This is a bunch of shell scripts and Perl scripts. So, controlled substances is the name given in U.S. law to drugs that they really don't want to see sold without a doctor's permission. Now, there are different rules for that everywhere. I recall having trouble buying allergy medication last time I was in Singapore, so probably they have even tighter law here than in the U.S., but every country has sovereignty, has the ability to decide what should be legally sold and not. Anabolic steroids are what's called Schedule 3, and bodybuilding drugs would be an example. And this is bad stuff. I don't know exactly how bad it is. I am not in the anabolic steroid industry myself, so I can't tell you exactly what happens if you take it when you shouldn't, but I can tell you that the government takes it very seriously, and you can go to jail for a long time and pay a lot of fines. In other words, if you can find this stuff online, it's somebody's taking a huge risk putting it there. And anybody in the value chain, including in some cases credit card carriers, are putting themselves at huge risk just to be carrying this stuff. We looked with, I'm sorry, I lost my example slide. I apologize for this. So there was spam, and it advised you to go to buysteroidsonline.com. As usual, it was hidden behind a proxy provider. And in this case, the MX record uniquely identified them a little bit, but the text record absolutely outed them because they didn't want to get spammed and they didn't want to get their domain forged, and so they put in an SPF record. Amazing that spammers don't want to get forged, but nevertheless, that SPF record told us exactly which mail server their mail was allowed to come from. And it was the same as the server that the MX record pointed to. And we did the same dance, looked at all the other domain names pointing at the same IP address, and looked for just the RR name that came back from that, which is to say these are what's called, RR name is a DNS technical term. It doesn't matter. Just take my word for it. These are the names that pointed to that IP address, ran it through that same little cheesebag Perl script, and we found a whole bunch of related domains, and that gave us more to work with because all of them had worthless whois information, but each one of those has their own passive DNS history, and you can find out again where they were before they went to the proxy provider. And so simply by doing this short dance and then repeating the process on each of the results you got from this short dance, you were able to make passive DNS useful to you again, even though the bad guys have taken a few steps to try and make it useless. Helios is the currently the biggest spammer on the internet. It's spam as a service, so it shows that you can Uberize anything. and it's a botnet, so they download malware into a whole bunch of PCs, not so much for the purpose of credential theft, but just to provide a relay point for a spam run. So the reason that it is hard to stop spam by blocking the IP addresses it came from, which is what I was doing in 1996 with a company called Maps, is that they're moving around constantly, and the places that they're sending it from will be new every hour. And they can only do that by putting a lot of malware into a lot of online servers. I want to mention, by the way, the Internet of Things is going to make this much better for them, because the code that is in your toaster, your microwave oven, your refrigerator, your home thermostat is going to get upgraded less often. So whatever bugs it has will be there for decades, and they will all have the ability to relay spam, because we tend not to block outbound traffic from these things in case they have to phone home. So think of these as the good old days before the Internet of Things got big. So here we received a bunch of unsolicited mail for a Pills host. This was europefarm.com, and they were all botted hosts. There are a couple of different Helios tracking sites that will tell you who is part of this botnet this hour, but that's not fast enough. They will actually move around in sub-hour intervals, and so you can't necessarily use it to block email, but you can use it to maybe, after you've received something, determine that the reason you received it is that some Helios bot relayed it to you. And we went off and looked at that and said, okay, what's going on with all this? They inform you of that. Okay, so as a native butcherer of the English language, I can tell you that's not how I would have written those words. So this is a little bit unusual. And we took that unusual phrase and the other one, a permission. That's something that a native English speaker might not have written. We took that and just Googled for those exact phrases and asked Google, what are the various other websites that use the same text? Because this text became almost a signature, almost a fingerprint for this particular author. And sure enough, there were a whole bunch of related sites. We picked one. So even though the www.europefarm.com was at 186.2 something, this other clearly related site was at 85.159 something. And we decided, all right, let's take the history of europefarm.com, get all the addresses from that. Am I back? I'm back. So we also built a list of things from that second website. I can just talk loud? No, okay. And so we ended up with 2 IP address lists and said, all right, what's in common? What addresses were used by both sites? And there were only 4 of them. And I got to tell you, 4 of them is a much better list of things for me to spend my time chasing than 40,000 or 4 million, which is how many we started with. So back to that second level DOM Perl script to go find the delegation points of all the domains that have ever pointed at those 4 addresses. And we looked at the results, and if there's 700 results, that's too many. I'm sure the tools could be written that would go through 700 results efficiently, but I'm kind of thinking I'm going to use these 10 fingers to do the next thing, and I don't want to do it 700 times. So we said, all right, what we're doing is not working. It's not narrowing the field far enough that human energy can then take it to the next step. So we looked at the things that were in common between those 4 results. And got it down to 39 things. And there we found 39 domain names that had been used by all of those 4 addresses, that had used all 4 of those addresses. And I got to tell you, 39 I can deal with. So to sort of graphically identify that, we found 4 addresses that were in both files, and we found a bunch of domain names that were had used those, and looked at the domain names that had used both, or used all 4 of the addresses, and we targeted those for another round of microscopic evaluation. All right, so that finally brings us to the topic. That was the background. If you are sort of doing data science, you're often in the business of trying to correlate 2 enormous signal sources and make some kind of sense out of it and say, I know that these came from the same place, but they didn't get here on the same path, so they're completely scattered. They're all over the darn place. And, how can I take the disparate pieces of this signal that have been reflected to me along a lot of different signal paths and turn it back into something that will approximate or identify or characterize the original source of that signal? So what this looks like graphically, and this is from a textbook that then went into Wikipedia, this is what multivariate stuff looks like, is that if you're getting a signal on the left and a signal on the right, and you simply plot them in 3D space and look for the density, then you will learn what the original signal probably looked like. Now, I wish that what we could do with Passive DNS would be as easy as this. It's not. Now, one of the things that we don't do is sort of hope that it's all going to be linear and straightforward, as the signal processing example I just gave. And it's not continuous, and there aren't standard metrics. There isn't even a standard order of magnitude to search within. So visualizing this will not produce anything as clean as what I just showed you. What we do is we look at Booleans or multiple choices, look at your position on the spectrum, and we try and come up with some really coarse-grained metrics from each signal, because we're not treating this like a machine learning problem. This is we're not trying to get the next great patent in how you do signal processing. We're trying to find bad guys, and so we got to keep this simple. So some of the examples I've shown you actually already did that, where you simply make several lists and look at the crossover between different output sets. So here we were wondering, all right, Google is not a criminal, in my opinion, and we have seen them in our database, I don't even know how many digits, that's almost 1.8 billion times. And these are cache misses, not cache hits. So that's how many times some recursive name server in the world did not know the answer to the google.com result and had to go fetch it. For every one of those fetches, there were tens of thousands, maybe even millions of reuse events from that same cache. So I'm not saying that I see every time somebody looks up Google. I think no one other than Google could tolerate that amount of data. But I do see whenever one of our sensor operators needs to do a lookup in the great sort of DNS cloud in the sky using Google's data. And so just from that, I can get some idea of what a popular non-criminal site ought to produce here. And this is obviously cartoonishly simple. You need more than one data point to characterize, but this is, after all, PowerPoint. So we then looked at a different result. This was 70X, whatever. This was something that came to us in spam, and ran the same test. Just how many times has this been witnessed? 1,109. Okay. So that's not the same. That's out of character, and thus is worth looking at. Now, ideally, you would, take a sample of hundreds of popular non-criminal names in order to build a larger, richer set of parameters for, if it's within these limits, it's probably like us. It's probably not criminal. It's probably popular. but you would end up, hopefully, with a cutoff, a threshold filter like this, where you just say, at 1,109 observations, it's worth me checking further, whereas with 1.8 billion observations, it's not. I can't get further along this path. Let's give up. And ultimately, all warfare is economics. You're trying to drive your costs down and drive the other guy's costs up. And so one of the ways you drive your costs down is to avoid pathways to nowhere. So the earlier you can stop searching in a direction where there's probably going to be nothing there, the lower your costs will be, the better chance you're going to have of winning that battle. Now a lot of host names are just crap on the face of them. We see about 500 new fully qualified names per second. Only 2 of them are delegation points, by the way. We only see 2 delegation point creation events per second, but we see 400 or 500 of these longer names being created every second. And if you do some fairly simple pattern matching, you can tell that this is not Apple. But it might look like Apple to an unsophisticated user. And statistically speaking, we've got more than 2 billion users on the internet today, and most of those people are unsophisticated by the standards of this room. So this works. The reason that we see this is not that somebody is trying to make it work and they haven't figured it out yet. We're seeing this because it has always worked. Because if people see Apple somewhere in the middle of something, they'll say, it probably is Apple. But then you go there and it looks vaguely Apple-like on the website, but this is not an Apple website. So we did the same thing for Bank of America. And, these are just common everyday brands that we see and hear in the U.S. economy. And so we just looked for the easy stuff. Looking for the harder stuff would require you to do some fuzzy matching, like look for Bank of America with zeros instead of O's and ones instead of I's and so forth. And we have a number of customers that do brand enforcement, and they incorporate our raw data for that reason. But these were the easy ones. These just jumped out at us and said, this is a Turkish website, bosnakliat.com.tr. And it shows bankofamerica.com both as a subdomain and as part of the URI. And, even though the website that you go to from that looks like Bank of America, it probably isn't. I wanted to show you an image example. I'll see if I get to that. I'm running out of time. I want to say a couple of things about Passive DNS collection. Edward Snowden has raised the specter of the surveillance state for all of us. I am not a Snowden fan, but I do live in the world that he has shaped. So for the entire 10-year history of our project, long before Edward Snowden made his disclosures, we have been very careful about end-user privacy. And I urge that you do the same, and that you encourage any vendor of data services that you're going to do business with to do the same. So we see the cache miss transactions. So that recursive server in the middle is where most of your lookups are happening. So this phone is connected to a recursive server given to me by the Black Hat Wi-Fi cloud. And I'm making my queries. I am a stub resolver, and I'm making queries of that server. And that server knows my IP address. It also knows my ARP, my DHCP. It knows my MAC address. It would not be hard if you were down there where I'm showing the personally identifiable information pointer. If you were down there, you could probably figure out exactly which queries came from my 10 fingers. And, if you're my employer, I probably gave you that right. If you are part of the government of the patch of dirt that I live on, I may have given you that right. But if you're just some security practitioner somewhere in the world, I did not give you that right. And you should not be doing anything that helps you correlate my activities to my identity. And we don't. We collect above the recursive, so all we see is when that recursive server doesn't have something in cache and has to go fetch it. So we see the IP address of the recursive server. And that means if you took some really horrible child sexual abuse website and you saw that you had a lookup for that domain name and you've got the itch to like drive over to their house and kill them or something like that, you can't. All you know is that they were, in Texas somewhere because they've got one name server complex for all of Texas in a particular ISP that I know of. And that's good. That doesn't mean that I want to see more child sexual abuse. That means that I don't want to be in the surveillance business. And I'm hoping that none of you do either. So what I have tried to show here is how you can take the traditional passive DNS results that are working less well and combine them with some non-DNS data to go multivariate in your searching. We all need to be, scanning our own employers, our own networks, our own universities, and so forth, and building up more data that we use for our local investigations. But I'm hoping that none of that makes it into the cloud. Surveillance capitalism has not been good for me. It's not going to be good when it gets stronger, so I don't want to be one of the people helping write software for it. So, I have much motherhood and apple pie on this slide. So let me say thank you. Thank you for coming. It's early in the morning on day one. You are all hard asses for being willing to get out of bed and be here at all. And we have about 7 minutes for questions. Please ask questions. Yes, sir.
What can you actually do when you identify somebody?
I'm sorry, say it again.
When you identify somebody with this, what can you do after that?
So, thank you for pointing out that I'm only talking about the detection and enrichment phases. Once you know where something came from, really what you're going to do about it will depend on you. If you are in the law enforcement world or if you have close ties there, you may be able to launch a criminal complaint against somebody who did some bad thing. If you're not, you may still be able to, let's say, launch a civil lawsuit. That's another common form of recourse. Those are both work. In other words, those both involve work that starts today and finishes sometime in the future, and most of us can't tolerate that kind of work because our hair is already on fire for 100 different reasons. So what we will actually do is try to get them removed from the internet, figure out who their providers are, and complain to them and say, hey, your resources are being used for criminal purposes. Here's the evidence. Please take this guy off your net. And if you do that for Akamai or Cloudflare or whatever, they will probably go along with you. The other thing I see people do is to say, all right, now that I know who it is and I have a reasonable way to figure out what other assets they also own that they haven't attacked me with yet, I'm going to block them all. I'm just going to assume that anything from any of those IP addresses or to any of those IP addresses is bad for me, and I don't want to participate there. There is now something in Bind called RPZ, which is a DNS firewall that can be programmed much as any normal IP firewall can be done. We will shortly have code to make that work in Unbound if you're a Bind hater. But that's another thing you can do. If you know that all of these domain names are bad, you might just block all of the lookups to all of the related domains. In RPZ, you can actually poison the name server name or the name server IP. So if you know that this name server, either by its name or by its IP address or maybe by its IP address block, is only used by bad guys, you might decide, I don't care what the name is. From now until the end of time, I don't want to resolve any domain name that relies on that name server. So I would say poisoning as a way, kind of a reasonable confidence method of defending yourself against future attacks by the same gang is the most common thing that we do, but that again is because we're busy. If we weren't so busy and we actually worked on recourse that would hurt these guys, either put them in jail or cause them to pay big fines, then we might actually start to curtail the future damage a little bit. Right now, all we can do is defend a small part of the net that is sort of high enough up the technology totem pole to be able to use these techniques. And unfortunately, that leaves enough victims out there that these bad guys don't care that they can't get to you anymore because they have plenty of other raw meat to go after.
The passive DNS providers, are most of them open, or are these commercial subscription-based?
So there are, of the various passive DNS projects that I'm aware of, all of them give free access for nonprofit use. So in our system, if you're a law enforcer or an academic or whatever, you don't have to pay. And I think that BFK does the same thing. DNS Parse does the same thing. RiskIQ and Passive Total do the same thing. So the intent of all of these systems is to first do some good in the world, and then second, sustain themselves. So if you want to make commercial use of it, you're going to pay. But if it's a non-commercial use and you're not developing derivative works that compete in some way, the chances are you won't have to pay. And, just to follow up with that, that is one of the hooks that I use when I ask recursive name server operators to please run a sensor and send us their data. It'll make them a little bit safer because any crime that takes place or that has one leg on their network will be better observed. But it also helps them to help the rest of the world because of all the freeloaders that get access to our system without paying it. So I more or less, even my heart is here, right? I've clearly spent my life in public service before coming back to the commercial world to do Farsight. So I clearly want to make the world a better place, but I also have to behave this way or I wouldn't have any sensor operators. And I think the other competing projects are in the same situation. Question in the back.
Just to confirm, you said for nonprofits and law enforcement to use these services for free. Do you think like the API version, or because I know for other passive DNS services there is like a free version online, but you have to pay for like the API.
If it's, I can only answer for myself. I don't know the precise business practices of the other passive DNS projects, but if you're an academic and you need the API because you're trying to push out chapters for a PhD thesis, you will not have to pay. If you're a nonprofit company who is working on your own self-defense, then we'll give you a gigantic discount on what a commercial company would have had to pay, but you will have to pay. Because if you can afford salary for your people and you can afford electric power for your building, you can certainly afford to pay a little bit to help sustain our services. But none of us are trying to sort of make our success on the backs of public benefit nonprofit companies. But I will say, related to that, law enforcement users that want the API, if it's agency-wide, we'll set up a contract for them because they want to control the reliability of their services they depend on. But generally they don't. Law enforcement users tend to be a little bit less technical, and what they want is a web user interface, and they're going to cut and paste. They're not so much interested in writing software to talk to an API. Any other questions? It's 14 minutes after the hour. So again, I thank you for coming.